moderate this discussion, we have Huda Jaffer, who is the lead designer at SELCO Foundation. So our panelists for this session are Arvind Balsubramanian, who's with the Azim Premji Philanthropic Initiatives, where he supports partners in their journey to build their own organizations. We have Jeffrey Prince, who's the program manager of renewable energy at IKEA Foundation. Dr. Veena Joshi, who is an energy and development consultant, formerly with Swiss Development Corporation and TEDI. And Pakzang Dastur, who is an associate director heading the research team at TASCA.
I think this panel is a good segue from the first session, because a lot of what was touched upon in the first session was how there isn't a safe space, there isn't enough flexibility, how the relationship between funders and fundees, where fundees aren't allowed to fail, or there is a lot of society pressure or pressure from organizations and institutes where you cannot report failures. It is about numbers, it is about metrics. When you write a proposal and if you say you haven't met it, then what happens? Does your funding get cut? How would people perceive your approach or your organization? So there is a lot of this constraint around failures in philanthropy specifically, and we have a set of people who are very experienced in exactly that, in philanthropy, in giving, in funding. And so, let's see how we can shed some light around those aspects. So I'm going to start with Arvind. Arvind, if you can, probably start us off with giving us one or two specific examples in your experience where you've seen an organization or an NGO or a fundee, come out with a failure. Where they've actually come out and spoken about a failure, and how have they come out, when have they come out, why have they come out and spoken about it, if you've seen that, and if you haven't, then why not?
So, I'm going to disappoint you a bit. We are a young organization, especially if you superimpose the human age. We are 4 years old, right? But we've done well. And when I'm saying we've done well, it's in the context of this conference. We've done well in failing, but we've not had any spectacular failures, which will bring home the point. But we've been consistently failing in certain things. And when I'm saying consistently failing, it is not this from a sense of improvement. We want to improve and we want to. I'm saying we've been failing, which we need to correct. And I had the question in mind, and this is what when I prepared, I thought might be useful to reflect upon in this group. So our main job is basically, as an organization, there is this one bank account and there are these 100 bank accounts, and we are the conduit which helps move the money from one place to another, where there's an ambition to give and there's an ambition for impact on that side. So the organization that I'm part of, or my job basically, complicates this whole process. Whereas everybody wants to do it in a simple manner, we complicate the stuff, right? So one key point, which when I think about why this happens is, if you ask, at the one end is a service provider, it's our partners who are service providers and so on, who want the process to be simple to access funds which will help them do their work. On the other hand is the board who wants to make simple decisions in order to move towards impact. And everybody says that the process is not simple, and it has become more complicated over the last 4 years. We did a recent exercise in just trying to reflect on our work so far in the 4 years, and realize even our staff members feel that the process is getting more complex. Right? So I think one reason is the fact that we haven't found, from the role of this philanthropic organization, haven't found an elegant way of trusting organizations, allowing flexibility in their work, and that results in the fact that every time we try to solve this problem, we add a feature to the process, it ends up as a bug to the partner or the board member. And also what is simple for one is not simple for the other. So a completely bespoke model of funding would be simple for a potential partner. A completely standardized way of giving would reduce the bandwidth required for giving from an organization and the board point of view. And that's the challenge that yeah. So I thought
yeah, so my answer to that is no, we don't really come up with our failures. That's the simple answer. So I used to work at Dune Foundation, now I work at IKEA Foundation, but as far as I know, no philanthropy will come out and say, this is what we failed at, and these are the reasons. The one example that I can think of is the CNA Foundation. They published something a few years back about an initiative they undertook and they failed at, but they were quite transparent in why and what didn't work and what did work. So it's never really published. So, but for example, when I worked at Dune Foundation, there was this openness and transparency to others if there was a failure. So for example, when I was at Dune, we had invested in a company that went bankrupt. But the bankruptcy actually wasn't so bad because it moved the market in the right way. So it was we always openly talked about it as a successful failure because we funded this very innovative startup and they were able to move the market, so we thought that was a good thing. So we didn't care if it was a business success, but we did care that it had an impact success. So that would be my initial response.
So I'll go with Jeff. I don't think we talk about our failures at all. I think there is an evolution to it, right? So most of the dialogue that you see outside right now, lots of people talk about failures, but they talk about the failures of others, right? So we are generally figuring out what the failures of the government are, other agencies are, etc. The dialogue now has moved to, we should be talking about our own failures. So a lot of articles that, if you type in philanthropy and failures, you will find out how we need to talk about it. But I don't think we've yet reached the point where everyone's comfortable about talking about their own failures. Though one area where I have seen movement, at least in the development sector, and being an intermediary, we have the privilege of, knowing some of the donor perspective as well as the non-profit perspective. There are various platforms, at least in this country, there is which we call accelerator programs for non-profits. I know there's one at IMD, there's one at Ashoka University, Dasra itself has an accelerator program. And what you see there is that all of these programs have been able to create a safe space for the participants there to actually share their failures and learn from each other. And so the question for me is how do we create that safe space not only in that stakeholder group, but across stakeholder groups?
I seem to be the only retired person on this panel. So I have the freedom to make some general remarks from the place where I was working and why I'm on this panel. I was at SDC for 20 years, and all of those 20 years I worked on the energy environment, whatever you call, pillar or sector or subject or whatever. And my own hypothesis and it's been lingering on in my mind for a long time, and this forum seems to be the apt one to share that, is culturally we define success very narrowly and appreciate it highly. This has been said before as well. So I want to expand the comments a little bit and say about what I'm going to talk next. Whatever question Huda asks, I have some answers in mind. So I was thinking what to speak with this audience, which in some way is connected either as a donor or as a donee, someone who has been in it for 20 years. One of the things that we all do is structure grants. So when I was looking into the kitty that I handled, I came across a grant that I worked on in early stages of my career on a renewable resources project, in which it was the first one from Global Environmental Facility to through World Bank, through IREDA, and the Swiss were, what should I say, the smallest donor. They had a TA, which means largely institutional funding, largely flexible funding, you know, something to play around with. And why did I choose that project? And then I'll give it to you. You know, when you look at a lot of things as a donor, one of the things you are expected to do is disburse your money on time. And that's pressure that is handled by large governments, and STC is a government organization. It is answerable to the parliament. If you know, only flexibility we had, unlike others, is the budget didn't get cancelled. If you didn't spend, you still had that money, so that was there. So this is one project where the money was left at the end of the project, and that's the story I'm going to share. Even though the project itself in the books is considered as satisfactory, highly commendable, etc., etc. But some insights going forward, I think, would be very helpful. So that's the reason.
So I got maybe some examples, not really examples from everyone, but Jeff, you were saying that you know, there was one of the projects where, you know, the company went bankrupt, and you were able to talk about it very openly, and, you know, because it moved the market in the right direction. So would that be because of, you know, something that Lowen did internally that allowed that, or, you know, was it just the fact that because happy things came out of it, you're able to then share it, you know, or was there certain failures that wasn't spoken about in this?
So Dune Foundation is very much focused on grants, loans, and equity in startup companies, social entrepreneurs. So that's the nature of the game, so to speak. So there was a lot of understanding that of the many initiatives that we might fund, many would fail and go bankrupt. So given the nature of the investing, someone talked about it earlier this morning, there's this culture, this, you know, wearing your badge of failure is something admirable in the startup world. So that reflects that. But I think, so a little bit of a personal note, I have the advantage of growing up with two cultures. One is the American culture and the Dutch culture. So if you dig a little bit deeper into success or failure, each culture will react differently on that. So in the Netherlands, they celebrate the Prime Minister bicycling to his work. That wouldn't happen in the US. In the Netherlands, they celebrate the culture of the professor with his briefcase on his bike. They celebrate the intellectual success, so to speak. So that's a very big difference. So at IKEA Foundation, for example, the culture of success is very different even than the Dutch culture of what is success or failure. IKEA Foundation is very much about humbleness. So the founder, Ingvar Kamprad, he's known for being very embarrassingly open about the failures that have happened in undertaking the enterprise. For example, when he invested in televisions, and that company went bankrupt as well. So I think if you dig more deeper in why does someone, what does a failure look like and why, it does touch on, there's this overemphasis of market, for example. Something successful, if there's a market and they scale and they make a lot of money, I don't, as a philanthropy or foundation, you can look at that differently. You can look at other things that could be successful. So culture is very, it could be a success in ethical terms as well. So, but again, I think foundations don't dig into these learnings. Is it a failure because of execution or ethics, or is it a market failure or impact success? A lot of these things we don't delve into, and I wrote it down for myself as that's something we should improve and something we should be more open about.
You mentioned about the complexity in the process, that is just, it's simpler for the board or for a funder, but it's complex for, a person who's receiving the money. I was just wondering if that or, other things that Reenaji touched upon actually hamper the conversations around failures that could be happening, which could lead to, better outcomes. Like what are the things that you feel are challenges in philanthropy that actually hamper this? Because very clearly, no, we don't talk about it. So what are those factors that lead to this, we don't talk about it?
So I had 3 examples. I spoke about one which I'm most comfortable with. I'll now speak about one which I'm less comfortable with. Right? So there is this, one of the programs that we started working in. We went about identifying the geographies on the basis of 2 things, on the basis of the severity of the problem and likelihood of success. Right? And we went about in a very systematic manner, looking at the devolution index and all to identify the right geographies that we worked in. Very soon, and we to assign ourselves another target, we said we learn by doing, and we went about making large commitments. We made a commitment about 50 crores, which would spread over 5-6 years. Okay. And then we realized that the devolution index, which is secondary data published by the government, which we use to make the decision on geography, is not really a good indicator, right? And we and our partners, we all realize it, and we are grappling with that. But there is this, there is this what we call the sunk cost fallacy, which is coming in. Right? It's not just the money that we've committed, but the time, effort, energy of our partners, which has already been in this. I think that's something which prevents us from easily accepting it. So I think we do accept it internally, but to be able to say the same, it becomes a. And I would think at least the first step would be to have an honest conversation with partners, where there is this trust which is built, and it's very difficult in a real life situation. But first step is that before we say publicly acknowledge anything, right? The point is to solve for it. So that's one thing which I feel that comes. And the other thing which comes, I feel, is, I think somebody else spoke in the morning also, is this act of confirmation bias, right? Whenever we go, we try to see, to be able to see it, go with an open mindset and look at an issue as we go along, becomes difficult. So I think those 2 things play at some level dynamics between both the fund agency and the implementing agency which deal with such situations.
So I think I'll go out on a limb and say that philanthropy itself is hampering the conversation around failure. And I'm talking very much from an individual and a family philanthropy view, because that's where, that's mainly who we deal with. If you think of the role of philanthropy, the role of philanthropy is to take risk, right? And I don't think enough philanthropists are doing that, right? They're trying to play the role of the government or some bigger agencies. The role of the government is not to take risk, right? They cannot afford to take a risk. They have to play it safe, and therefore someone needs to take up the role of experimenting, of figuring out what's right, what is not working, what's working. And I think if you say that the role of philanthropy is to take risk, with that comes the possibility of failure, right? And therefore you have to increase your tolerance to that failure. But because we've not taken on that role, or philanthropists have not taken on that role, what you're asking of the non-profit is not, okay, let's do something that no one else is funding, right? Is there something that I can fund you which will help you have exponential scale or growth? And if it doesn't work out, we'll figure it out. Right? So that's not the conversation. The conversation is very much what a government will ask you to do, or what a bigger agency will ask you to do, which is, tell me how many kids you'll reach, or tell me what outcomes will you have, and if you don't get those outcomes, if you reach only 80%, I'll only give you 80% of that funding, right? So I think that's the biggest hurdle to the dialogue of philanthropy. I think secondly, as an intermediary, we find this, ourselves in a situation a lot of times. We're talking to non-profits. We know things have failed on the ground because we're working with them to be able to implement programs. And then we're thinking of ways of how do we position that failure to the donor, right? Because you'll get questions like simple things like, you've brought on a COO or a CEO for leadership transition, something that huge organizations have failed to do, right, in the for-profit world. But with the non-profits, you're questioned, right? You're like, why didn't this work out? I'm not going to give you grant funding till you tell me who your CEO is. When the conversation should be, I will fund you to figure out the CEO situation, right? I will fund you to figure out how to get the right leadership in place, and if that means, giving you more funding or giving you more capacity building, or actually leveraging my own networks to help you, right? So we often find ourselves in that situation where we have to position also failures to donors, and we're trying to figure out how to make that more an honest conversation. Like Arvind said, forget publicly, even in a closed room between a donor and an NGO. And I think lastly, for ourselves, to talk about that for ourselves, I think we also get caught up in that many times, right? Because we also depend on grant funding for ourselves to work. And you're usually running after numbers, right? You're saying, okay, if I had a 30 to 40% growth every year, you start working backwards from that number instead of saying, oh, do I really need to scale right now? Or do I need to consolidate? Is it okay to show a 15% growth to my donor? They'll be asking me a million questions, as opposed to saying, this is the right thing to do. So it really, and we've kind of fell in that trap for a few years where we're like, you're running for numbers. And so that's the perspective.
Because of these very narrow, tight definitions, the collaborative spirit, and where does the collaborative spirit gets reflected first? In our ability to talk to each other about what's happening. So the conversation is hampered because it doesn't happen. It happens around everything other than what matters to me most. So, we'll talk of the weather, we'll talk of climate change, we'll talk of how bad Delhi pollution is, but we will not talk about what concerns us most, except saying we don't want our money to be used for A, B, C, D, because this is what we have written in our contracts. So this should change. This should definitely change, and in a conference like this, we should be able to see our biggest development agency, that's our government. I think subsequently, and why shouldn't the government be able to talk? I think if it is our government, it should be able to talk to us. So my wish for next round of this kind of a conversation is to have some of that as well, because the question of scale, and this is my last comment, the challenge of scale can only be addressed if we have both the citizens with us and the government with us. No amount of philanthropy, no amount of CSR, no amount of donor funds are going to take us there, because at the end of the day, it's to change the culture. It's a mindset question. So I think larger collaborations, larger conversations, and broadening the definition. And since we all know how to design new metrics, I think we should design new metrics to look at what's changing on the ground.
So I just want to respond. I would love it if governments take more risks, but I think politicians would lose their jobs if they did. I worked in politics for 8 years, so I know that no politician I worked for would admit that they did something wrong. So that's unfortunately, so there's a lot of work there. So pressures not to share learning is So for example, at IKEA Foundation, we have a relatively big budget and very little staff, so there's a push to go big and to go traditional. So repeating a bit what governments should be doing actually. So that's led us to invest very heavily in organizations like UNICEF and UNHCR. And sometimes I think we could be more risk-prone and seek out smaller organizations that could be more effective with the money, or at least do a combination of both. So there's that budget push to go big, and you know, with small things, when they go wrong, it takes a lot of time. And I already hear some of my colleagues like, oh, it's not going to be another one of this or another one of that, because they don't want to deal with you know, it's a lot of hand-holding that has to go on. So the other pressure that hampers sharing learning is, for example, because IKEA Foundation is relatively well known, at least for the brand, things that we do get a lot of publicity. For example, Better Shelter was, it's this flat pack refugee shelter that was introduced to UNHCR. It got a lot of publicity, so when people come up to me, they say, oh, it's great what you did with that, but we say, well, it hasn't been a total success, even though that the press has talked about it a lot. It's not really introduced into UNHCR because of all kinds of, you know, procedures that, in terms of public procurement or safety standards, or it's a little bit more expensive, so the budget restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. But these nuances don't come into the story. It's the flat pack and it's most revolutionary, et cetera. So you don't hear the failure behind the very little absorption of this new innovation. So the same with, we did a big solar power plant in Jordan, the Azraq solar power plant. A lot of people come to us and say, that's great because first you're doing something with refugees, and Jordan had to absorb these 1 million plus refugees in a small country of 8 million with very little resources. So it's great that you did this. At the same time, we said, well, we could have done it so much better because we just gave the money, and for a really long time, the solar power plant wasn't even connected to the grid. So it was, there was this asset just lying dormant, and the public utility was very happy not to connect it because the camp was paying 28 cents per kilowatt hour, and plugging in this very expensive asset would change the business dynamics for the public utility. So, but because of the big publicity, there's, which is nice, but there are very little nuances behind it.
Going off of that example, is there a way for you to differentiate between a genuine failure and just bad decision making? Like this is something that is actually, you know, not worth considering and looking at, and this bad decision making versus something that's genuinely that yes, you know, they did their best, the process was right, they failed, let's iterate with them. Is there a way?
This is exactly what I wanted to do. So the point is that philanthropies are willing, I mean, I'm talking from my point, I mean, our point of view that we hold in our organizations, we are willing to take risks, and typically the idea is we follow a portfolio approach. And portfolio approach means that you are different pieces of the portfolio have different risks towards impact, or it depends on time. Some of the programs are, some of our partners work on programs which are short-term in duration, some of them are long-term systems change problems which take 15, 20 years. And at the same time, there's different levels of uncertainty involved in different kinds of programs that our partners work on. And then there is these different types of risks that come. So for example, in one case it could be service delivery. In another case it could be mainstreaming a certain idea within the government system. So the challenges come in two ways. One challenge that comes is that if one of the program works about providing life opportunities to girls at the scale of 5,000 girls in 3 years, and another is mainstreaming a certain program which will again provide life opportunities but it can affect the whole state, it is very difficult to do a comparison between the two. It's not 10,000 versus the thing, because the certainty is different, and at the same time, from a point of view of just the emotional satisfaction that everybody in the system gets, it is different. So unlike in a portfolio which you apply in a corporate scenario, where the bottom line is in one currency, here it's not in the same currency. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is that we are willing to take risks, but the problem comes when the risk materializes, right? And the immediate reaction is to go for control. We haven't found another way of dealing with when the risk materializes. How do you deal with it? And that's the point. And everybody is cognizant about it inside the room. But when it comes on the thing, then to get the whole system, both from the side of from all the sides, right? From partners, from our side, from everybody, to be able to not get into this immediate reaction of let's control the situation. I mean, I'm looking forward to suggestions here to say what are other ways in which we can respond to it.
You know, I find this a little funny, these genuine failures, and I mean, who plans for failures? Nobody plans. Sometimes what happens is you make an error of judgment, an error in assessment. Your risk assessment is what you had at that point in time, the information you had. Where you are perhaps fairly accurate is what to expect, like what you were saying, that we are likely to fail, but we don't know how to deal with it. And I think that's a larger systemic problem, which also arises from this very narrow cultural mindset that we have. So all through our books, I think we should also highlight a lot more on alternative ways. I mean, you try once, you try twice. For example, sports is a good example, science is a good example, development sector perhaps is a harder example, but you definitely have, and I just want to take one example from what you said, connecting the solar power to the grid. Half the energy sector has struggled with that. You dig deeper, why does this happen? This happens because we don't value decentralization. You look at any field, we don't value decentralization, we value centralization. And we've done that. We've done that for the last 50, 60 years. Built centers of excellence, but have not worked hard enough to raise the averages. And scale is a game of averages. It is not centers of excellence. So it's very, very important to change some of these parameters, and these won't happen unless there are changes. I mean, the politics has to change, I'm sorry.
I agree with her when she says that, it's a little funny around bad decisions and genuine failures, because I do think that, in every, or at the center of every genuine failure, there is a bad decision somewhere, right? You've not been able to take the right decision. I think for us the question is, how do we ensure that we are making more good decisions than bad decisions, right? And how are we working, whether it's with donors or with non-profits, who are able to do that? And therefore, to Anshu's point earlier in the day, where he spoke about choosing, I think, the right kind of problems, he said. But here, it resonates with us because we think long and hard before we choose to partner with someone, whether it's donors or non-profits. And to really look at the leadership and say, do we ideologically, philosophically actually are on a line, or are we on the same page, right? And then once you've decided that that's the person or that's the organization you want to partner with, then you need to be a true partner in that sense, right? It's not a donor, NGO, or I am an intermediary and I have a donor coming in relationship anymore. Then you're saying that I align with you on a philosophical level. Now whatever comes out, whether it's sometimes be bad decisions, sometimes it might be good decisions, but we're in it together, right? And I think we are unable to, in most of these relationships, bring that perspective. I think we still go on with, like again someone said earlier, I am the donor, I am giving funding, and therefore you see that same wall from a non-profit, right? And they're not ready to share because their funding is tied to the outcomes, etc. It's not around, I'm going to give you the full funding, whether you fail or succeed. And that's what we try to do, right? We're saying that we will give you that funding, we will give you that support irrespective of whether you succeed 100% or not. And I think we've been privileged to even get donors like that. So if you look at Omidyar Network, if you look at some of the individual philanthropists, they've been able to take a bet on Dastra and say, we'll figure it out together, but we align with what you're trying to do, we agree with the ambitions, and we've failed quite a lot, right? In the last 2 years, in what I was talking about before, in the pursuit of trying to scale, in the pursuit of trying to grow at that rate, we've not been able to focus as much as internally as we would like to on senior leadership, on growing the team. All challenges of a growing organization, but we failed to do so. But we know that we have funders, or we have donors, or we have partners who will support us in helping us figure it out rather than saying that, we'll cut off your funding if you don't do that. So being able to build that relationship, I think, is key in individual stakeholder groups before we even go public.
So for us, a lot of the decision making is based on hypes, unfortunately. So as a foundation, especially in the energy access space, we have this herd mentality where we follow others when they start talking about mini grids or pay as you go, or now it's productive use, and without really understanding what we're talking about. So we'll repeat what other foundations are talking about, and we'll say, oh yeah, that sounds good, let's join, and without really understanding fully, deeply what we're talking about. So there are some major blind spots, as well as in how we fund, which is very expat to expat, unfortunately. It's not very locally embedded often. It doesn't celebrate local talent or people that don't look like us, talk like us, and things like that. So we need partners that challenge us and push us back on these blind spots. So that's the only way we can get good at what we do and build this institutional memory in making better decisions. And the other thing that we fail at is we don't have these feedback loops in our learning. So we do have sections on if someone reports on what they're doing, but it's not a day-to-day real-time feedback loop of we thought we would reach this, but we didn't, and we're going to course correct, and that's going to feed back into our learning system. So that's something that we fail to do as well.
Thanks. I'm going to open it up for questions really quickly, but I do want to keep in mind that one of the points that was brought up was the post-failure reaction to it, or the optics of failure, like what happens after something fails. And that's really something that seems to be a gray area in general, because what you mentioned and what you mentioned as well, like how does that after you fail you go into course correction. So we'll just open it out to some questions. We can go ahead.
Okay, hi, I'm Anjali Sastry from MIT. I have 3 ideas to put before the panel, maybe a bit provocative. One of them is, we heard this morning a bit about escalation of commitment. Is philanthropy prone to a trap whereby the people who get invested, say program officers, in a given project or endeavor, become identified with it and then don't want to themselves reverse course or disclose an unhappy result? So how to avoid that trap within philanthropy where you kind of get so enmeshed with what you're funding that it's hard to kind of call it. The second one is, I think there's a sampling issue. Are you guys studying what you didn't fund? Like, so there's huge amounts to mine from what you're already funding, but I always wonder about, is there a skill in observing what hasn't been funded as well, so that you can be savvy about your own sort of investment, but also what could have been, which leads to a third track, the problem of knowledge. You only ever have an N of 1. You have this lived experience of what you funded. How do you know you're drawing the right conclusions? It's notoriously difficult to learn from a sample of N equals 1. How do you look at the counterfactual? What would have happened otherwise, before, pre-post, even controlled studies maybe can shed some light on this, but for large-scale projects, it's hard to do that. So maybe part of the answer is the systems thinking kind of ideas and really looking at hints. But I think part of the problem in drawing these inferences is making them solid enough to guide action while remaining skeptical that you're fully correct. You may or may not be right. Doesn't mean you just have to keep talking. You can take action. But how do you cultivate that ability to say, guys, we think this is happening, but we could be wrong. Let's keep looking for data. So those three traps, the identification, the sample bias, the inferencing. Any thoughts? I'd love to hear.
On the first one, one idea we've been toying with is a fixed tenure kind of a thing for a program manager, and that's been done in some other places. Which, but to come with it without ensuring there is it doesn't violate the relationship that would have been built. Violate is not the right word. It doesn't hamper the smoothly to it. That's one thing we've been thinking about. But that's actually a very real thing that we want to address. And as far as building this knowledge, one of the ways we try to do it is so if n is equal to 1, the rest is infinity minus 1. To filter it down to a smaller number, what we try to do is on a particular issue we talk to other peers to say that at least the paths that they would have chosen would be a good filter for us to examine as we go ahead. So that's something which we've been doing over the last 5-6 months to see all the paths that we haven't taken. Right? So I'm reminded of one point that Taleb makes about this whole thing about black swans. He says that just like a black swan is a very improbable event happening, it's also the fact that it's very likely event not happening. So we should be looking at both aspects of this thing, and not just be concentrating on the event that happened, but what would happen.
Other questions? Or
Program officer's trap is real, and one solution is to rotate either within the institution or move from one job to another. I think that's very true. But about the sampling problem and the knowledge building, I think two things have really helped me. One is try and encourage not only just yourself, but your partners to see what's happening outside of their area of work. Who is copying them? I mean, a good example is SELCO in its early days resulted in shooting up many more companies to sell light. So the idea itself gets copied. So that kind of helps. So that's easy to deal with, though not scientifically rigorous in that manner. Knowledge building over time. You know, everybody, we were one of the early ones in the energy efficiency area, small scale industries area, but as we moved on, many other people came in and started funding many other dimensions. So with the resources that you have, you try and address the core of the problem, but then others join in with different approaches. So it really, I don't really see that as a big problem. The big problem comes when you are confronted with a government with a scheme which does not want to see the decentralized solutions that have happened, that have mushroomed, that have grown. And that is a very stifling phenomenon, not just in the energy sector. I mean, I've heard it in the education sector, I've heard it in the health sector. So I think that is where I would say the whole idea of building conversations, building collaborations, one would have to work a lot more on.
Hi,
my name is Meghna. I'm from Indian Housing Federation, which is a non-profit subsidiary of Ashoka. Initially during the welcome address, Harish had mentioned that startups have a culture of failing. So what my question is, what is the philanthropic sector's perceivement of non-profit startups? Because the proof of concept, the possibility is low. The possibility of failure is really high, but then like the scope of innovation is also really high. So what does the philanthropic sector feel about non-profit startups? That's my question.
Excuse me.
Can I come from a tech background. There is this notion of failing fast. So I was just wondering how can that notion be applied to the philanthropic sector? Like donors, when they give, can you build a rigorous assessment framework around giving that obviously it can't be as quantitative and numbers driven as the tech sector, but you factor in failure right from design and do periodic assessments so that failures are caught much more earlier.
Yeah, I'm Shankar Datta. I'm right now a retired worker. I've been in the development field for the last 35 years. One question that I want to ask the donors is how long is a long rope? Especially, we have had fortunately been funded by very sympathetic donors. Okay, Vinaji, Ajit, they were all supportive of us and they have given us long ropes to test out ideas. But how long? Because there are some of those projects, the project has closed some 10 years back, but even now we haven't found results. So we are still struggling and now we are writing proposals to continue those projects. Now, the question is, so when do we say enough is enough? Now let's call it a day.
My name is Libby Johnson. I'm learning to be the beggar-in-chief of Gram Vikas in Odisha now. I've come back to the NGO sector after a 10-year gap and I'm kind of lost. So I'm trying to clarify. We are talking about failures that eventually affect somebody on the ground. We are not talking about tech failures where a code failed or product failed. Now, what is the basis on which we as a community is using technology and the power of data to determine problems? And where does philanthropy stand with respect to the actual experience on ground and engagement with those experiences to identify those problems? Because in the last 6 months that I've tried to look at eventually for fundraising for Gram Vikas, I realized that the problems that we tried to say are the problems are not necessarily being valued. Because problems have been identified using technology and data. So I would like to clarify that, please. Thank you.
We get one more question and then we'll do one round of disclosing remarks. I think there was one question there that will otherwise. Okay, then we just go to so after Harish.
So I think this way so that you see everyone. So I want to just push you all a little bit. You said that you've realized that there are some failures. But those are probably, let's leave out the failures where the people were bad. Let's assume these are failures because the situation was not well understood. What percentage of those organizations or individuals have you reinvested in? That's the first question. And the second one, you mentioned that philanthropies should be taking risks, but they don't. What are the pressures that you are under to actually deliver on the other side? I thought philanthropy was basically money which is coming there to take a lot of risk. What are the pressures that you have to deliver, and how can we change that? What are the metrics on which you are measured on? Is it again numbers, or is it against taking risk? And how do we move the needle on that?
Just one last question and then we get to
Hi, I'm Sashi. This is again around risk, and a couple of them already addressed it. I'm just wondering, philanthropists are having money which is a crowd-funded money or a Carter setup, which is for creating impact through players in the field. So we are in a better position to use the money and take higher risk and not push for the rewards that the NGO sector would want to see themselves to celebrate success. At the same time, I do see lack of patience in the philanthropists to see the results. Is it coming because of us putting our money behind the purpose and the team and the outcome that we want to see, rather than the passion that the development sector leader who's chasing this whole game has? If we put in our money behind the passion with lots of conviction, we have a lot more patience, the long rope, how long is the rope, to kind of wait out on the outcomes. That's one question. The second is, whenever a funder pulls out money from a project, from an investee organization, that puts them in a very bad light for the next funder to even look at them with the openness of maybe there was something wrong in the decision making for the withdrawal of the fund. So how can we help it in terms of when a fund is being withdrawn to bring it to a logical closure that it does not put the investee organization at a disposition with the next investor?
So I think mine is more of a comment. I believe that things have changed, but we have not accepted a lot of it. Like, if you see what mistakes or failures the international so-called INGOs, as they are called, they were making, we are also doing the same thing by selling the poverty. To remove the poverty, you have to sell the picture of a poor kid. Well, that's exactly what we are doing. We are also thinking that by providing midday meal to millions of kids, we can change the scenario of education. So to be honest, there is nothing changing. So what used to happen in the international organizations with the money and all, lot of things have started happening in the funding agencies thing. And we know that a lot failed. But if you see, the same formula is applicable in the CSR money now, which is a new money. Exactly the same principles, same causes, same geographies, same way of operating, same numbers, same everything. And unfortunately, today the new thing which is happening, and which is a very positive part, which is the individual philanthropy money. But if you see, the large part of advisory group to those people who have good intention are actually again doing the same mathematics, same geography, most of them. I will not say all, because Farzan is also sitting here, so I need to be careful. But if you see, it's the same formula everywhere. So if you are not learning, again what I was talking about in the morning, the arrogance of it, if you are not learning out of it that what has failed in a particular system in the last 30 years, how will you really improve in the next 10 years with the much bigger ticket size of money, resources, people, everything?
It's what you said is something to reflect upon. Where do you learn from? What are the new sources where you dig in to develop new approaches and new innovations? Because historically, this is what that has happened. So do you set it all aside, make a start afresh? And a lot of new things that are happening. I saw a website called Social Co-op, and the name itself kind of put me off. I said, how can you name something which is meant for, and that comes from an image of a co-op in my mind. So I think something to ponder upon. I don't have immediate solutions, but I definitely will keep this question. On this whole issue of right, wrong, at STC I often used to say, what do we do? Do we seed? Do we recognize a sapling? Or do we recognize a flowering plant? when we fund? And that's a question each one of us have to ask ourselves who are in the privileged position of giving. And again, one last comment and then I'll give it on. I would plead that, okay, we cannot invite the government, but we definitely can invite politically thinking people, you know, who are in the field of changing mindsets, in influencing how people think. This is my last remark. This country is not known for queues. But when demonetization happened, I was aghast to see queues at 12 o'clock in the night. So there is something that influences the mindset more than we all have tried to do. So I think somewhere, some bigger, deep thinking perhaps is required on new approaches that will integrate citizen participation and also the political thought processes. We may not do politics ourselves, but the thought processes are important, because if we keep quiet, then we will be less tolerant.
So I think for us, it's important that we move towards making ourselves redundant, right? We shouldn't even have an environment where you need an intermediary to be able to initiate a conversation or a dialogue between donors and non-profits. So that's the vision with which we're always working towards. Now the pressures, someone asked what are the pressures that we face, and I don't know if it's the right word to use, pressures or challenges, but if we, for us, what's important is to build Indian philanthropy, at least for Dasra, right? That for decades we've seen foreign funding coming in, and now there's enough wealth within the country to be able to give off. But if we look at wealth in India, it's relatively new, right? The givers who are giving now are relatively new givers, barring a few, very big family names. These are first-time givers, and therefore there's a sense of inertia. There's a sense of, fear of whether the money will be used well or not. And therefore someone like a Dasra is still relevant in being able to pacify those fears or to be able to open up their minds, because a lot of these guys are from the business sector. Now our endeavor is to not bring in our own bias as an advisory, is how do we build a relationship of trust between those non-profits and the donors directly, and how after a few years we actually exit that relationship so that that's moving ahead without us necessarily being the conduit all the time. And therefore the way we would look at it is how can we do that at scale for many non-profits and many donors, and not always be that intermediary. Remove that first level of fear and inertia, because we've seen that as donors, especially in a much shorter time, now it's 3 years, 5 years that they've started experimenting, taking more risks with non-profits, that they automatically understand their comfort zone and are slowly able to take more risks when we don't need to be there. So I think it's not as much as pressures, as much as challenges of a new, to use a very business term, a new market, and therefore you need perhaps folks like Dasra, but the endeavor always is to move and make ourselves redundant.
Yes, I would reflect that as well with the question about how long-term is a relationship between a funder and a receiver, so to speak. I would say try to make yourself redundant, because that agenda is more appealing than how long do I get funding. So that's a specific response to one of the questions, and reflecting on what you said. The other is about the appetite for failing. I think so a lot of foundations, including ourselves, they like the simple analysis and sort of the glamour and the picture of we're going to solve this and these are the numbers that we're going to reach. But I think moving away from that and having an honest conversation where you say, listen, this is our agenda. We're going to work on the processes, and we're going to work on the general aim, and we're going to iterate and fail and work through that. I think that's a picture you can sketch to a foundation as well nowadays. It's not all about the glamour and the simple solutions and the quick fixes. I think foundations should be able to delve deeper into analysis that makes sense beyond the numbers and beyond the picture. I guess there's so many questions that I wrote down, but I'm sort of lost my train of thought, so I'll just hand it to you.
So aware of the time, so I'll just quickly go through the questions and try to give my reactions. The first one is around questions around non-profit startups, culture of failure, failing fast, so assessment around giving for this kind of thing. So we are trying to use technology in some ways to ensure that everywhere where the organization is not able to give a nice evaluation report to show the proof of the work that they've done, we have other ways of building something with them which can quickly give us the confidence to give. So we are trying out things like which includes feedback from the end users as well through an IBRS system or a Discord system or something like that, along with some view into that. The other one is around this lack of patience. The other set of questions around lack of patience, how long is a long rope, funder pulling out money is a huge moral hazard. So we are very cautious about these things, and we are thinking through these. The point is that so of course at the end of the day we have all but our partners to do anything that we can do. So and we have all but 100 our partners. So we take a very close think of each. We don't have a principle kind of a thing and go about. We go about it very in a bespoke manner because it comes in very few cases, exceptional cases, and we are very cautious when we approach it. On the third thing around metrics, what pressures that we have and so on. So we are trying to move from, currently we are still learning to move from this line item approach of funding to a results framework approach of funding. We have a sense of a framework through which we can look at all types of impact, whether it's different perspectives, different levels of impact. So we got all some of the jargons around it. But the idea is that the work that is happening should be able to be represented in multiple ways depending, and the ones that suit different types of work should find space in the way we can interpret it. So that's the big challenge for us. We've made a first, because it's been 4 years and we've got first cut of it now because some of our early partnerships are maturing. In terms of reinvestment, that is one metric which we would be tracking for our own performance, that it should go up. In the sense, as if our processes have improved in selecting partners, in building longer relationship, then the tenure of the relationship should increase over time. We are probably, again, the first round of renewals were fairly positive, and we hope to do better in that. So that's a good internal metric for us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Veena ji. Thank you, Parsan. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you. Please,
Thank you for that. All the panelists, again, for that frank and open discussion and engaging discussion on the role of philanthropic organizations. Before you all leave, a small token of our gratitude to all of you, to Arvind, to Jeff, to Veena Joshi, and to Pakistan. Thank you so much.